Well, an ideology is a simplification of reality, where the vast, seething, messy baroqueness of being is put through some kind of rasher of language and comes out grossly simplified. And because it's grossly simplified, it becomes like a kind of algebra of idiocy, where now you can set up these little equations and they solve themselves, and you get a feeling of satisfaction from that. But in fact, the whole thing betrays the human enterprise. And to give you a graphic example of what I'm talking about, I'm thinking of a scene from a novel called Corelli's Mandolin by Louis de Bourneres, where a guy who's a communist in the Greek partisans during the war beats a villager to death who has given shelter and food to some non-communist partisans fighting in the mountains. And the protagonist of this particular part of the novel says to this guy, as he's beating this old man to death, he says, "Why are you killing this old man? He is harmless." And the guy, without even missing a stroke, turns to him and says, "It's a matter of historical necessity." This is the voice of absolute fanaticism speaking, and this is the voice of pure ideology. In other words, unconscionable acts. The Holocaust, up to that level of unconscionable acts, become intellectually defensible in the presence of a complete corruption of language. And so ideology always paves the way toward atrocity. Well, ideals and ideology are not quite the same thing. Ideals are simple and don't knit themselves into vast intellectual structures. In other words, an ideal of mine is to do as little harm as possible. I may not meet this ideal, but it is an ideal of mine to try and to do as good a job as I can. But in the name of that ideal, it doesn't lead on. There isn't a therefore. Therefore what? Therefore I should become a Mormon. Therefore I should no longer eat meat. Therefore I should no longer have sex. Therefore, no, there isn't that kind of implication. But ideology always implies implications. If man is, as Marxists say, an economic creature, then the following must follow, and the following must follow from that. So I think ideals are very close to our emotions. They're things that spring from the heart, and their boundaries are not well defined, and the implications are not clear. I mean, if I say my ideal is to do good for mankind, the next step is not at all clear. But if I profess an ideology, the next step is always deceptively clear. So I think ideologies flatten complexity. You know, people don't like paradox. I'm not sure why this is. I think it's a quality of print culture. People want closure. They want every program or every intellectual argument or every examination of a phenomena to end with a conclusion. QED. Therefore, this is what it is. But you don't have to be a rocket scientist to notice that this betrays the complexity of the world. The world is never one thing or even several things. The world always has dimensions which exceed the descriptive machinery that you're applying to it. And I don't know who it was, George Bernard Shaw or Nietzsche or some other 19th century bad boy, but it has been said that the essence of intellectual maturity is being able to simultaneously hold two contradictory thoughts in your mind at the same time. Now you are actually approaching the beginning of intellectual maturity. But if you're always saying, well, if it's this, then it can't be that, and if it's this, it can't be that, then you have been hoisted on the petard of dualism. And it's more than a joke to say that dualism is the root of all evil. Of course it is. It's the root of all good. And what really we are given is a seamless continuum of phenomena that we are asked to not to understand. That's preposterous. Why should talking monkeys understand reality? But to feel. We can feel. We have an extremely complex body and nervous system and perceptual apparatus which ushers us into feeling. So you have not mastered a situation when you understand it. When you understand the situation, you are probably on the road to catastrophe. When you feel the situation, you are probably moving into a good position then to act in that situation. And often usually we do not understand our feelings. That's a strange thing to ask of one's feelings. If we understand our feelings, it's simply a footnote on our intellectual housekeeping. It is neither necessary nor sufficient. What is necessary and what is sufficient is feeling into the moment. I think this is where we got to at some point earlier in this, that the felt presence of immediate experience is the defining phenomenon of being. If you can't reach it, you are in trouble. You need some kind of help, psychedelics, therapy, loving kindness, something. And if you can reach it, then you have contacted the authentic domain of being. I almost said of humanness, but it goes deeper than that, because the animal world is living in that space. Well, I think because of the good offices of quantum physics and some other things, we are beginning to realize that things like chaos, like paradox, these are not names for intellectual black holes. These are names for the sources of life's richness and its creative advance lies in these things. Reducing, as we have done over the past 200 years, the universe to a machine, some kind of a machine, then robs it of meaning. And then we stand back and look at our lives and our societies and say, how come they have no meaning? It's because we labored like demons to make sure that they didn't have meaning, and now we have no one to blame but ourselves for the gross simplification of reality and the betrayal of experience that we achieved in that process. You know, years ago in Canada, there was a political party called the Social Credit Party, and they had a very complex scheme that nobody could understand. And they ran on the platform under the motto, you don't have to understand social credit in order to vote for it. So this is sort of what you're talking about.
Harold Stasson's great thing was Harold Stasson's precedent.
Why not? Yes. Feelings are primary. The primary datum of experience is feeling. And then out of that comes a logical reframing of experience. And then still lower on the rung, and I maintain low enough on the rung that one shouldn't go that low, is an ideological recasting of experience. And it's a delicate thing. I'm not offering a simple answer here. It requires constant fine-tuning and intelligence. And to look at, and every day I think we have to, it's almost like we need, what is it that the Marxists used to do? Criticism, self-criticism. We need to be alert to ideology. It's constantly seducing us. Yeah, dialectic. But the idea of criticism, self-criticism, that you constantly, you and your colleagues or comrades constantly search your behavior for betrayal of the ideology. I think we need to constantly search ourselves, not for the betrayal of ideology, but for the embracing of it. And say, oh dear, I'm starting to believe something. Slap, slap. Ah, that feels better. Because these ideologies are incredibly draining and distracting. They get in the way between us and true feeling. On the other hand, if you don't apply logical razors to experience, then feeling is open to all kinds of interpretations that become somehow themselves springboards to ideology. I think it's really important to try to keep things as simple as possible, because they will still be hellaciously complex if you are true to experience. The simplest explanation of what is going on here is still maddeningly Baroque. So throwing on flying saucers and papal plotting and the plans of great Atlantis only further exacerbate the problem. If you just deal with the given of the fact of your history and your destiny, things are quite complex enough. And of course, again, what the psychedelics do is provide a reference point in organism. It's like a reset button. It says beyond ideology, beyond cultural programming, beyond language, beyond hope, beyond fear, beyond expectation, there is the raw datum of experience. Here, have a dose. Didn't work? Have a bigger dose. And if we keep returning to the raw datum of experience, then these other things, they will recrystallize around us, but not with the imprisoning intensity that they have for straight people. We know that behind all this constipated social stability lies the chaos of the psychedelic experience. It's important to keep it in mind in very unpsychedelic situations. But people who have never broken through the cultural dream take it to be reality and commit crimes based on delusions about what is and isn't reality. Well, not to speak of whales and dolphins specifically, but nature as a dynamic field of activity beyond the reach of politicians, image makers, and so forth and so on. Nature is the constant psychedelic companion of the human experience. I think, we know this. That's why we crowd into cities and build walls and keep nature at bay. If you go into nature alone and don't eat much and don't speak much, within 72 hours, the hills speak and the winds confer with you and you are conveyed into an animate, caring, living, natural dynamic. But it's threatening to the ego. This is the first time in 2 hours I've used this word. But the ego is a maladaptive, tumor-like growth in the personality that has been inculcated into you by the toxicity of culture. It is literally the response to toxic culture is the growth of ego. The more toxic the culture, the more the ego is revered as a natural value within that culture. So responding to dolphins and whales and anthills and termite swarms and these kinds of things is an opening to the natural dynamic that's all around us. Many people never observe nature except when psychedelics force it upon them. But this is a very, I think if you feel afraid of psychedelics, but you want the juice that you may sense there, take up wilderness camping and do it assiduously. And though it's a slower process and you may not have specifically colored hallucinations, the conclusions that you will emerge with are essentially the same as the psychedelic voyager emerges from. And nature is deep, ordered, dynamical, and caring for the project of being. And so should we be. And the order that we seek is the natural order of our bodies and our minds in interface with the world, not the unnatural order of ideology, commodification, propaganda, and a misuse of communication. No, I think it's very difficult because the process of education, without anybody quite knowing where the crime was committed, has turned from a handing on of cultural values to a handing on of this neurotic behavior around commodification. And people are clueless, and they're being used and abused. Seemingly intelligent people behave in incredibly stupid ways. The phenomenon of the respectability of aimless shopping. Shopping is unconscionable. It's stupid. It's tasteless. It's murderous toward the earth. And yet, people who teach at Esalen will suddenly drop their guru persona and whip out the charge plate and head for Robinson's. What kind of thinking is going on here? They are clearly not alienated enough. Alienation may be for them just a stance, but where they're really comfortable is down at Barney's, racking up the charge card. Somehow the message has to be put across that there are no exceptions to the obligation to decommodify experience. And anybody who feels alienated from this orgy of consumerism is going to have to look elsewhere for their values. I feel blessed because I guess I'm just so alienated that it doesn't touch me. But recently, for some reason, I had to lay out my income for an attorney and say how much I spent every month on things like entertainment and so forth and so on. So he called me on the phone. He said, you declared $15 a month for entertainment. He said, based on your income, do you know how much would be a standard deduction for entertainment? And I said, how much? He said, $700 a month. I said, that's inconceivable to me. What kind of idiot would I be? And I put down the $15 because I knew you wanted something. But in fact, I don't think I spend $15 a month on entertainment. What is entertainment anyway? I suppose it just sounds like preaching a kind of monkishness, but what is the charm of all this crap? Can anybody explain it to me? I heard a story about the Dalai Lama. Let this ricochet around in your mind. The Dalai Lama came to Los Angeles, and so the committee that was there to receive him and make his visit comfortable wanted to do something with him in L.A. that would be uniquely L.A., but that would be amusing for Dolly. So they decided to take him to Rodeo Drive. And basically they just turned him loose with his translator and said, we'll meet you back here in an hour and a half and check it out. This is a unique place in American culture. So then after it was over and they were all having their double espresso or the Campari or whatever they were having, the Dalai Lama said, I want to thank you so much for making this experience available to me. I feel I understand Americans so much better now. I saw so many things I wanted. This is the Dalai Lama talking. He saw so many things he wanted. Well, if the Dalai Lama is not immune, my God, what chance have you and I? If the Dalai Lama can't hold this stuff back, you might as well buy that Hermès scarf. Just give up. Give them the $200 for the damn thing and enjoy it. Yeah. Well, as an old anarchist, I can tell you, efforts to organize anarchists are so fraught with contradiction that I wish you luck, and I'll make a small donation. But I don't think it can be done that way. I think. Yes, you will definitely give me $15 worth of entertainment per month.
I'm listening to this and I'm thinking what my father would say if I told him, yeah.
Well, I hate to tell you this, but I would never do what you are doing. This may be the ultimate teaching. Do not ever again spend money to see me. My God, how much income is going down the drain as the ultimate oral empowerment is given.
Yeah, you run it off.
Well, okay, as long as you take it as entertainment, that's fine. I have one more little story. I didn't tell you the story about the two rabbis, did I? Good. This is my ending story for the afternoon. I don't present it as a summation, but it amuses me. For those of you who don't like Jewish jokes, you will notice as this joke is told that it is easily translated into a Zen mode, a Sufi mode. I just like the Jewish flavor. There were two rabbis, extremely advanced high rabbis, Talmudists, great men of accomplishment. And they were at temple. And one of them prayed. And he said, Lord, he stood up and he spoke aloud and he said, Lord, I am nothing. And then he sat down and the other guy got up and he said, Lord, I am nothing. And there was a guy there sweeping the floor, a custodial person. And he thought, well, people are praying. Get a prayer in here. So he stood up and said, Lord, I'm nothing. And the first rabbi looked at the second rabbi and he said, so look who thinks he's nothing. That's it. That's a story about the imagination. The time wave is a variable wave scaled against time and can be scaled against very large amounts of time, even amounts of time larger than the life of the universe, thousands, millions of times larger than that. And you might ask, what's the point of scaling a temporal description over periods of time so vast that there is no reason to assume they ever existed? Well, the answer is that at these transition points, these dramatic shift points, the software automatically, as in the course of running the algorithm, keeps track of days to end, days until you get down here to a hypothetical end point. Even if this is not billions of years, but trillions of years, it will keep track of this day count number. And what we discovered to our bewildered amazement was these day counts were almost always prime numbers or the product of two primes.
What are you measuring again?
Well, I'll answer your question, but it isn't relevant to what I'm talking about. What this is measuring is the ebb and flow of novelty and habit. And you've actually led me back to the main track, so we'll get serious and get out a pointer. That's always a sign that we're really serious. I don't want to give my ordinary time wave lecture because I've given it enough that the meme is actually established in the culture, and there are dozens of tapes of it and written versions and fights on the internet, and so why should I explain it to you all over again? I'll just assume that in the course of talking about specific issues that relate to it, you will pick up the rules of the game. And then if you're just too excruciated by your confusion, you can ask a question, and I'll try and answer it. The basic assumption is there is a quality to reality which science has overlooked. Some people in the East have called it Tao. I want to divorce myself from the freight of that tradition, and I want to call it novelty. Novelty is the quality in nature that seeks complexity. That's what it is. And its countervailing force is called habit. So what I'm proposing to you is that we live in a universe ruled by two fundamental forces that are larger than physics and electromagnetism and all of those good things. And these two forces are habit and novelty. And in every situation, whether it lasts a millisecond or a billion years, the struggle between these two tendencies of the universe can be discerned. Now, it's pretty self-explanatory what these terms mean, but I'll run through it. Habit means repetition of previously established pattern, continuation of a equilibrium situation, a tendency for a system to degrade entropically under the aegis of the second law of thermodynamics, a conservative tendency, a preservationist tendency, habit, right? For crying out loud. Okay. The other thing is novelty. the opposite of habit. What is novelty? It's the new, the untried, levels of complexification previously unachieved, unusual connectivity, creativity, surprise, novelty. And these two things are locked in struggle over vast scales of time. Notice I did not say eternally locked in struggle. They are not eternally locked in struggle, because the good news is novelty is winning. Novelty is winning. If you get big enough chunks of time, though there may be vicissitudes, ups and downs, ultimately the situation ends up more novel than it started out. Ilya Prigozhin, who got the Nobel Prize for work in non-equilibrium thermodynamics, called this the principle of order through perturbation, a counterintuitive phenomenon in physical chemistry, because for a very long time, one of the strongest held faiths in physics was that the universe is undergoing thermodynamic degradation. In other words, everything is tending to fall apart. Prigozhin showed that this is not true, that even in physical systems, there can be simple physical systems, there can be spontaneous mutation to higher states of order. So what's really going on in the universe is a struggle between these two tendencies. Biology represents the emergence of a very novel set of chemical strategies for the preservation and maintenance of novelty. The emergence of higher animals and culture and language and technology, these things are also novel strategies building on previous achievements in the novelty department, building toward our dear selves. And one of the interesting things about this kind of thinking is it gives a new importance to the human world. Science will tell you that we're lucky to be here and we're simply the awestruck witnesses to some kind of incomprehensible thing that has nothing to do with us anyway. Novelty theory would say, no, human complexity represents at this point the apex of accomplishment in the domain of novelty, and hence somehow the cutting edge of universal evolution in this moment in space and time has come to rest in ourselves. So, what else do I want to say about this? Well, let's look at this screen for a minute, and I'll sort of explain the rules of the game. This is a span of time portrayed along the horizontal axis, as you're used to seeing. In this case, it's 7 billion years, simply because we set it to be so. And this represents the ebb and flow of novelty. Now, here's one moment in the next 2 hours. If you pay attention, this is the moment. When the wave moves up, habit is increasing, not decreasing. It's counterintuitive if you're into the stock market. In the stock market, we always want it to go up unless we're selling short, but none of you would do that, I'm sure. So in this case, the excitement is where the wave moves down. And if this is 7 billion years, notice that what I said is true of this screen. We end up in a far more novel position than we started. We started out up here. Habit was winning the battle for at least 700 million years along here. Then it lost its foothold, and novelty surged forward almost uninterruptedly, although this is quite a hiccup. It probably lasted 200 million years, this hiccup. And if you want to get a notion of the scale of what we're looking at, then life emerged from the primordial oceans at the top of this pimple. All this is what's called the Archaeozoic and the prebiotic phase of the Earth's existence. Yes? Good question. It derails my plan for economy, but since you had the intelligence to ask it, you should probably be told. The basic data, and I don't want anyone to laugh. My God, you laugh before I tell you. So that it doesn't hurt so much. The basic data comes out of the I Ching. And, thank you for being so polite. If somebody had told me, this is the most powerful attack on this idea, and it begins like this. So, you want to make a revision in physics based on a Chinese occult divinatory system? Are we getting this correct? Well, in spite of the sneering, let me see if I can make it make a little bit more sense to you. I'm not going to review what the I Ching is in an environment as exotic as this. That would insult our intelligence. The interesting thing about the I Ching, even its skeptics agree, is that it seems to work. Very puzzling. Other forms of sortilege seem much less certain. Here's what I think is happening. First of all, let's look at the Western notion of time as we derive it from Newton. The Western notion of time is that time is what is called pure duration. All time is, in Western physics, is the place where you put process so that it doesn't all happen at once. Time has no quality. It's pure duration. Think of it as a perfectly smooth surface. The only modification to this doctrine in the past 500 years is Einstein came along 100 years ago and said, in the presence of massive gravitational fields, this perfect smoothness is slightly distorted over very large scales. So we go from perfectly smooth, pure duration to very slightly curved space-time. But the main idea, which is contiguous through all of these intellectual evolutions, is the idea that the local fine structure of time can be portrayed as a zero-dimensional space. If that's too technical for you, it means that locally it is okay to think of time as perfectly smooth. I say it isn't. Why should it be? This has to do with a form, remember we talked about sentimentality and how it can distort thinking. This adherence to the idea that time is perfectly smooth is a sentimental notion left over from our infatuation with perfect geometrical shapes when Greek science kicked off about 2,500 years ago. It took Kepler and Copernicus to demonstrate that the orbits of the planets were not perfect spheres because God loves, or perfect circles, because God loves perfect circles. And one by one, the perfect objects of Greek mathematical and geometric theorizing have been laid aside. The planets do not move in perfect circles. Nothing else has been found to have mathematical perfection, except that this idea of pure duration has been hung on to. And there's a reason for this, and I apologize for the digression, but it's very hard to snip the loose ends on a thing like this. The reason this idea of pure duration has been hung on to is because science, modern science, does its business through a series of hat tricks called probability theory. And probability theory is the idea that you can learn something useful about a phenomenon. Let's say, for instance, you want to know how much voltage is running through a wire. Strange thing about this value that you come up with is this. It is not necessary that it correspond to any one of the 1,000 measurements that you took. It's entirely possible you will get a value that is not congruent with any one of your measurements. But we say with confidence, well, it's the average. It's the average. Lurking behind this notion, average, is the unexamined assumption that time is completely uniform, that it does not matter when the measurement is made. And now, why do we assume that? Is there any reason to assume that? Well, not looking at nature, no, there is no reason to assume that. Looking at science, hell yes, there's a reason to assume that. You can't do science unless you assume that. Because science depends on what is called the experimental method. An experiment is you arrange a funny little unusual situation which is designed to cause some phenomenon normally lost in the noise of being to be thrown into high relief. And basic to the idea of experiment is what is called the restoration of initial conditions. In other words, we're going to roll a ball bearing down a ruler and measure its velocity. And we do this. And then we say, restore initial conditions. That means pick up the ball bearing and move it back to the top of the ramp. But now notice that time has passed since the first time the ball bearing rolled down the ramp. If time is not uniform, then you cannot restore initial conditions. If you cannot restore initial conditions, you cannot make sense of probabilistic data. So we have assumed and preserved this sentimental notion of Greek science because it makes it possible to do modern science. If we were intellectually honest about what's going on, then what we really should say is that probability theory and modern science is the study of those natural phenomena so coarse-grained that an assumption of a restoration of initial conditions does not destroy the integrity of the phenomenon. In other words, it's a lens that can be focused only to a certain depth. And beyond that, it begins to give false data. Of course, ball bearings always roll down ramps the same way. Of course, two liquids always mix together in the same way. But who cares about these things? What we're interested in are love affairs, dynastic transitions, corporate takeovers, political revolutions, family feuds. And the interesting thing about these things is they never happen the same way twice. Have there ever been two identical births, divorces, love affairs, corporate takeovers? Of course not. We would not even expect such a thing. We understand that the complexity of those phenomena ensures their uniqueness.